Hey guys, welcome back to the show. It's your boy Jay Hennihan, back with another episode of How to Kill a Sacred Cow. Tonight on the podcast, we have Geoffrey Drumm. Well, Geoffrey who, you say? You ain't never heard of Geoffrey Drumm? Well, I promise, after you get through with this presentation, you are never going to forget him because his theory is so incredibly unique, I've never heard it anywhere. His theory is that the pyramids used to be great industrial chemical manufacturing plants. I will say that again, but a little slower. The pyramids used to be great industrial chemical manufacturing plants. I'm going to let that sink in because, like I said, I never heard of it before. And I started watching his YouTube videos when his contact was sent my way. And then I started talking to him. He sent me his book, read that. It took me like a few days because it's relatively short. It's a novelized version of his theory, playing out over the course of the journey of the protagonist. And like I said, until I spoke to the dude, I almost wasn't even entirely convinced. But I think this theory has some water. I think this theory holds water, and I think it definitely deserves to be spread. Definitely go check out his YouTube channel. It's the Land of Chem. It's very easy to find. You can find him at thelandofchem.com. You definitely go check out his book, and definitely show this dude some love. And if anybody wants to talk to me about it, I know this is some crazy shit, but after speaking with him, I think that this is a theory that definitely should be looked at. The great thing about it is that it's not mutually exclusive, and it still allows space for all of the other theories, the astrotheological theories, the geometrical, the mathematical stuff, all that cool stuff that we all love about the pyramids in Egypt. All of that stuff is still allowed, you know, and this dude is he's such a great dude, so nice, so down to earth, easy to talk to, and he's got a cat, you know, and this is one thing, this is a little bit of an aside, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but why does all these motherfuckers got cats? Everybody's got cats. Every time I'm talking to someone on Zoom, they got cats that crash the party. Conspiracy Kyle, David Warner Matheson, all these guys got cats. Anyway, that's besides the point. I want y'all to check out this dude, show him some love, and just definitely think about it. You know what I'm saying? If anybody wants to get in contact with me, find me at jhennihan or at howtokillasacredcow on Instagram. You can email me at howtokillasacredcow@gmail.com. I'm working on the new website, howtokillasacredcow.com, making it just easier for everybody to find my stuff or, you know, experience it on all the different platforms. Since I was taken off of YouTube, I'm setting up a new channel. It's going to be just Jay Hennihan. You can find me on YouTube at Jay Hennihan, but this is a very visual-heavy presentation. It's still going to be palpable in the audio form, but you're definitely going. It's definitely worth checking out the video form. So I'll put it up on that new YouTube channel, Jay Hennihan, but I will also put it up on Odyssey. This audio might come out first. I don't know. I'm still working out all the details, but guys, check this guy out, Land of Chem, thelandofchem.com. Go check him out. And without any further ado, say his name, Geoffrey Drumm. All right, everybody, welcome back to How to Kill a Sacred Cow. Tonight on the show, we have Geoffrey Drumm. Jeff, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, sir. I appreciate having me on. Excited to be on the podcast.
I'm excited to have you here, mainly because I am fascinated with ancient Egypt, history, all that stuff, all the alternative histories that have come out over the last few decades about the possibilities of ancient Egypt, all this different stuff, and you provide an entirely unique perspective on ancient Egypt, as you could tell by your videos on your YouTube channel, The Land of Chem, as well as the book Land of Chem. So, Jeff, how did you get started on this journey, and what led you to write the book? What started your fascination with ancient Egypt?
So very good question. So I think I've said this before, man. I'm like pretty much everybody that researches ancient Egypt has like a bit of an Indiana Jones complex. So, you know, growing up, I remember watching with my dad, watching Raiders of the Lost Ark and all these types of movies about, you know, traveling to ancient Egypt and the excitement and suspense and all that kind of stuff. I've been interested in Egypt since I was a little kid. And then, so around 2012, right? So the end of the Mayan calendar and the beginning of the dawn of the age of Aquarius, right? So everybody that's kind of in our age range started to go through this spiritual reformation, right? Where we were shedding off the ways of the old time. And I began to get interested in all things esoteric, right? So, you know, theories about ancient Egypt, studying the pyramids, researching the possibility of there being lost civilizations somewhere in our history, different theories like Agartha and giants and all these kind of things. I was exploring all of those kind of alternative theories across the globe, and really, really settled on studying the Egyptian pyramids and all of the alternative hypotheses that exist regarding the possible function of these structures. So yeah, it was around 2012 that I really started diving into researching the pyramids as a serious hobby. And then in 2017, I also say the universe works in mysterious ways. And I was working for an IT company at the time. Not that I have any experience whatsoever in the IT industry. I don't know jack about computers, but happened to get a great commission check one month from sales, and decided to go to Egypt for the first time in 2017. And I was actually going to research one of the theories that the Great Pyramid was designed to produce electricity, right? Which is one of the most popular alternative theories about that particular structure. And I was going with this really specific research itinerary planned. And as we started to explore some of the sites, and we actually got a chance to go to a number of different locations that I didn't anticipate seeing, everything that I was starting to see at these locations was not compatible with the theory that the ancient Egyptians were producing electricity. However, I started to discover that there was kind of a different story to be told that was connecting these ancient structures to the science of chemistry. And that's the premise of my theory, and the premise of the book is that the Egyptian pyramids were designed to produce chemicals on an industrial scale.
Which is totally out of the... I had never, ever heard of this, which is why I was so fascinated. I had to get you on the show.
Yeah.
And it really adds to the mystery of ancient Egypt, because you get not just many theories. I mean, you do get some crazy ones, but really it seems like these things were multifunctional. And,
absolutely.
And so, you've got all the math, the geometry, the sacred geometry, the astronomical alignments, the astrological implications. You've got I've had Larry Paul on the show. And
yeah, I know Larry.
Yep, and that's actually how we found you, was through Larry Paul. And so, and he has the idea that everyone's heard that the three pyramids of the Giza plateau align with Orion, but he thinks that that the larger area around aligns with the larger constellation of Orion. So it's like there's so much literature out there for alternative theories of what these things are, and it seems like and one of the things that really started to make me think was, I think back in maybe around that time, 2012, I saw a presentation where someone was positing that they were actually spiritual. There were places of spiritual rituals and things like that, because many of these pyramids were obviously not tombs.
Right.
And so that really got my brain going in a couple of different directions. And then when I heard that there was a possibility that these things were being manufactured in chemicals, I was like, oh, those, Saqqara, the Red Pyramid. And then once you started pulling all those out, I got really excited. So maybe, and you've brought you've put together a presentation for the show, and you can whip that out whenever you want. But what are your summer thoughts like? What were some of the indications originally when you went there to Egypt that something else was afoot?
So you're 100% right that these theories are definitely, or these structures rather, are multi-purpose, multifunctional. And I do believe that they are temples for initiation, right? So the builders of these structures encoded all the knowledge of their civilization within the constructions themselves. So the geometry, the mathematics, the construction techniques, the engineering, all of these ancient sciences are literally built into stone. So the pyramids of Egypt are essentially like encyclopedias of ancient knowledge, which also encapsulated the knowledge of chemistry. So part of my theory is that, again, this civilization that built these structures was very well versed in the science of chemistry. And we know for sure that even in the historical record, Egypt is the birthplace of chemistry. And that is where we even get our modern word for chemistry. So the title for the book is The Land of Chem, CHEM. So that's a little bit of a play on words. And I can fire up the presentation here in a little bit for the original name for Egypt, which was KHEM. But yeah, so the most fascinating thing about all of the alternative theories to me is that they aren't mutually exclusive. So what I talk about in the first book is the function of the interior components of each of the pyramids. And I present an explanation for the function of the step pyramid, red pyramid, bent pyramid, Giza pyramids. And then I also talk about some of the structures in Ireland, but that's just the interior components, right? So there's a whole other aspect in terms of the remainder of the structures that I'll be getting to in the second book that I'm currently trying to write now. So if you'd like, man, so the title of your podcast, How to Kill a Sacred Cow, I actually have some pretty interesting information regarding the deification of cattle in the ancient world as connected to, well, the production of methane gas and the production of chemicals.
That's so dope, man. Fire it up.
Okay, cool. And if I start to ramble, just let me know. So let me share this. Hey, can you turn on the screen sharing option?
Yes, I can. You should be all set to go.
Cool. All right. So can you see my screen now?
No, I cannot. Aha, now I can.
All right. And tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill my video here because my video is going to kill the audio quality on this thing. So let me do this. And then we should be good to go. So can you see my screen?
I can.
All right. So we're ready to roll. So again, the title of my book is The Land of Chem, an initiation into ancient chemistry through the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. And, it's a fictional story. It's a narrative of a young man's initiation into the science of ancient chemistry. And he travels from Ireland to Egypt to receive the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids. And during each degree, he is told exactly how these structures operated. So again, the sacred cow and the deification of cattle in the ancient world has been one of those fascinating mysteries to me. And there's a few symbols from the ancient Egyptian dynastic religion that I never really understand the justification for the deification of these animals. For example, cattle, right? So you'll see cattle as a sacred symbol in basically all of the ancient civilizations across the globe. And in my opinion, all great esoteric symbols have many layers of interpretation. And there's always a superficial layer that is related to spirituality and religion and oftentimes astrological context, right? So we know that bulls were very important animals for domestic purposes, for farming. They were symbols of fertility and longevity and strength. And the bull is also clearly connected to astrology with the constellation Taurus, et cetera, et cetera. However, I believe that the true meaning of this ancient symbol is connected to chemistry and, again, the production of methane gas. So my hypothesis is that the step pyramid of Saqqara is actually designed to produce methane gas on a large scale. And I actually found this, just a little bit of information about the deification of cattle in the dynastic Egyptian religion. So, of course, these were prized animals, right, that contributed a whole bunch of different aspects to the general welfare of the population. But this is actually the first academic text that shows that their dung served as a source of biofuel. So it made a lot of sense to me that if the dynastic Egyptians were utilizing cattle manure for the production of methane gas, then that these animals would then become godlike animals because of the properties of this sacred chemical. And there's a lot of evidence that methane was actually pretty prevalent in the ancient world, which, as I began researching this theory, I learned a lot of things about the ancient civilizations that I had no idea about. For example, that the ancient Chinese were actually harvesting methane gas and using bamboo pipelines to transport the methane gas. And one of the first discoveries of methane gas was actually in ancient Iran circa 2000 BC. And these ancient civilizations, you also often hear of the symbol of the sacred flame, this esoteric symbol of the sacred flame, of course, being representative of spiritual enlightenment and resurrection. But again, the esoteric interpretation of that symbol related to the flame from methane gas.
So where were they piping the methane to? Was it just in places of worship, or was this like an infrastructural thing for the people of the cities?
Yeah. So, in regard to the ancient Chinese, and this is talking about, historical and archaeological record facts, kind of just building up on these things. So the ancient Chinese were harvesting natural deposits of methane gas, and they were transporting it in these bamboo pipelines directly to basically domestic locations where it was used for like cooking and lighting and heating. But one of the main reasons I think the pre-dynastic Egyptian civilizations was harvesting methane gas would have been for metallurgy and smelting of different metals, because that high temperature flame would have been very, very useful for facilitating metallurgical purposes.
So historically, when in the modern era did we start using methane gas in a similar way?
So it's actually been in use since this time. I mean, even from around 2000 BC. So again, the ancient Iranians were discovering these natural gas seeps, and the lighting and the energy that came from this methane gas was regarded as a divine or spiritual existence. So that's actually one of the other kind of theories that I posit in the book and on my YouTube channel, is that in the ancient world, magic was actually chemistry. And in the ancient world, there's all these stories of ancient magic, et cetera, et cetera. Well, to a practitioner of ancient chemistry, they would have understand the science. But to somebody that was uninitiated in the science of chemistry, anybody doing chemistry would have appeared to be magic. So in terms of, our natural day, they've been using it since the ancient times. I mean, that's one of those things that have kind of been incorporated in our modern society, and methane has pretty much always been used as a fuel for miscellaneous domestic purposes.
When did we start using it infrastructurally? I'm sorry, forgive my ignorance, and furthermore, when we get farther down the line, forgive my ignorance of chemistry. I almost failed it. The one thing I almost failed.
Oh, absolutely. So in the modern world, so this is another very interesting story to be told, is the progression from ancient Egypt and let's say the veiling of the science of chemistry through the medieval period under the guise of alchemy. Because during that medieval period, it was very much a persecutable offense to be practicing any sort of science. So again, these practitioners of ancient chemistry hid the science under the veil of alchemy and this spiritual transformation to disguise the fact that they were actually practicing chemistry and doing this quote unquote ancient magic. So the use of methane and all of these chemicals kind of came around in the modern industrial revolution. So like early 1900s, you'll see the development of chemical production on an industrial scale. And there's actually some connections between my theory and the development of modern ammonia production. And we can talk about that a little bit when we get to it. But again, we kind of went through this modern industrial revolution in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that's when we as a modern civilization started to implement all of the small scale chemistry on an industrial scale.
And isn't that fascinating too? That during the Dark Ages, during the Middle Ages, that the church would be seeking to stop people from reading, progressing scientifically. It's just, it seems to be there's something there, like spiritually, all that stuff.
Sure. Oh, well, there was definitely an agenda of suppressing information and suppressing knowledge during that time period. And again, in the ancient world, the practice of chemistry was very much forbidden, right? Because there was only a certain percentage of the population that had been initiated into this ancient science. And they were literally the practitioners of this ancient magic. And even in ancient Egypt, there was a priest sect that was dedicated to the practice of chemistry. And again, you'll see, and even in like the Bible, so the Magi, right? That is a word that directly connects to our current word for magic. all of which those were all practitioners of ancient chemistry.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It's really incredibly interesting. So the foundation for my theory is that Egypt is the birthplace of chemistry. So we know, even from the historical and archaeological record, that the ancient dynastic Egyptians were the first practicing chemists. They were the first to develop synthetic pigments. They were making dyes, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, and they were particularly adept at using chemicals to extract metals from their ores, like copper and gold. And we see in these ancient civilizations, even in South America and in Egypt, that their gold, for example, is like 99.999% pure gold. And it is almost impossible to get that purity of gold through a smelting process. And one of the only ways to get that kind of purity of gold is via a chemical extraction process. So that was one of my questions, is how are they getting this pure gold if, according to the historical archaeological record, it was just from smelting? Well, if they had been implementing chemicals to do this, it would certainly make the process a lot easier and the purity of the metal much higher at the end of the day.
And so how protected was this knowledge? I mean, obviously the regular people, the masses must have been, they must have noticed that it had to have been coming from somewhere, right? I'm sure questions were raised, or was the priesthood just that, I don't know how else to say it, but just that in control of information that they could even stop people from raising too many questions? Because, I mean, I could only imagine. Okay, so what's the explanation? Just that it was magic, that they were practitioners for God?
So I believe that, if they were, so let's take a trip back, right? So the time frame that I use in the book is circa 7,000 BC. So I've been very interested in the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BC. And we see in all of these ancient civilizations the myth of the arrival of the creator gods, right? These mythological inhabitants that arrived at the dawn of these civilizations, and they had the knowledge of construction and mathematics and geometry and astronomy and astrology, all those sciences already intact when they arrived in these ancient civilizations. So I have an idea that North America was covered by an ice sheet during the last ice age. And there's a lot of research that says that a comet hit that ice sheet and the civilization in North America was completely destroyed. Well, part of my hypothesis is that there was a massive civilization in North America that had this knowledge. And during that cataclysm that ended the last ice age, there were refugees that fled from North America, and they brought that knowledge into Europe, into Africa, into South America, and into Asia. And those are the quote unquote creator gods that arrived to these ancient civilizations. So as these individuals began to establish their new civilizations in these new locations, they incorporated their knowledge of chemistry within these ancient structures. So again, there would have been a group of people that were initiated and aware of the science of chemistry, but the civilization at large definitely would have benefited from the use of these chemicals. For example, the production of ammonia in the Red Pyramid, well, they were using ammonia for fertilizer. So fertilizer would have been applied to the crops. They certainly would have been aware of these chemicals, but it was only the initiates into this ancient knowledge that were the actual practitioners and the ones that were the carriers of this information for later generations.
And I don't want to be jumping around too much on you, but
no, go ahead.
How would if we're looking at the longer timeline, because I don't know, have you read America Before from Graham Hancock? I'm
very familiar. I haven't actually read the book, but I'm very familiar with Graham Hancock's work.
Yeah, because what you're describing sounds a lot like that. I mean, I believe he made a great case that there was not only just a civilization here in the Americas prior to the Eastern Hemisphere, but also that it was a high civilization. There was a cataclysm, and then they use seafaring technology. They go elsewhere, but You think they came back, and that's where the Mesoamerican the Mesoamerican myths come from? Is from the return from Africa of these of some of these people that held this knowledge?
Yeah, so there's a very interesting story about the Hopi ant people. Have you ever heard about the Hopi ant people?
It's familiar, yes.
Yeah, so the Hopi Indians actually describe the origin of their civilization coming from underground. So let's say, for example, and I'll go ahead and throw this out there, I think Atlantis was North America.
Hmm.
You know, the huge civilization that was completely destroyed by this cataclysm. I believe that was actually the civilization in North America. And so the Hopis believe that their ancient ancestors during this cataclysm actually lived underground, and they hid underground until the surface terrain was ready to be re-inhabited again. So let's say that they inhabited North America, this massive cataclysm with floods and all these other changes completely destroyed the terrain above. So you see all of these civilizations going underground in North America. And then when, you know, North America was ready to be re-inhabited again, the Hopi ant people come back up, and that's the beginning of the Hopi civilization here in North America. So I do believe that there would have been survivors of that cataclysm that eventually led into the Native American civilization here in North America. But again, I think we see that proliferation of that ancient society across the globe. And yeah, of course, I mean, after they had resettled across the globe, I mean, there's plenty of evidence of global travel and global infrastructure and, of global communication, trade, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there would actually been communication between all of these ancient civilizations.
Have you heard of the tunnel cities underneath Cappadocia in Turkey?
Oh yeah, like Darren Kuyu.
Yeah, they could house tens of thousands of people, like miles and miles of tunnels with rooms and functioning rooms and all that stuff. That throws the whole mainstream timeline like just right out the window. You know, to have burrowing technology like that, and it was a whole city underground. It wasn't just like that's absolutely incredible. So I think that's well within the realm of possibility that they would go underground in America. I would wonder if there's been any have you heard of any evidence of any underground cities in America? Anything that's been dug up?
So unfortunately, I don't think there is any like historical or archaeological evidence of those sorts of things. Again, we do know that in like the paving of the railroads and the industrialization of the North America continent, I mean, they pretty much just bulldozed everything indiscriminately in the establishment of our current infrastructure. So if there was anything like that, it would most likely would have been destroyed when we were developing the continent here. And also, if they were to ever find anything like that, it probably wouldn't have been brought to the public's attention.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how they had how that information got out from Cappadocia. Like, it's just like, and this is definitely the era where it's absolutely stunning to me that we could make discovery after discovery of things that just destroy the traditional timeline. And people just keep moving. They just move along. But I'm sorry. Continue with the slides.
Oh no, so that was pretty much it. I just wanted to jump right in and go ahead and kill that sacred cow and give my explanation for this esoteric symbol as connecting to the science of methane production. And that also goes into the symbol of the scarab, which is one of these symbols within the dynastic Egyptian religion that it never really made any sense to me. So they say within the dynastic Egyptian religion that the scarab is a symbol of the rising sun, of rebirth and resurrection, and it has multiple different connotations within the dynastic Egyptian religion. But at the end of the day, it is a dung rolling beetle. And I never understood how essentially a beetle that's pushing around a ball of shit is going to be related to the golden rising sun, the glory of the day, the most important thing that we have in the solar sky. I never understood how this dung rolling beetle was connected to the rising sun. But as I began researching the production of methane using cattle manure, if you were going to do that in a large scale industrial structure like we do today, the first step in the process would be to collect the dung. And that is exactly what the scarab does. And so my theory, again, connecting chemistry to the Egyptian pyramids, my attempt was to come up with a hypothesis that was more compatible with what we know is true of the Egyptian civilization, and something that is a little bit more practical, right? So again, a practical interpretation for the deification of the cattle. Well, again, if it was used to produce methane gas and its cattle manure was essential in that chemical reaction process, it would make a lot of sense that the cattle became one of your deified animals. Same thing with the scarab. If this is a symbolic representation of the dung collecting process in preparation for methane production, it would certainly make a lot of sense that this would also become a sacred symbol that was incorporated in your religion. And then, of course, it also has, religious and spiritual interpretations as well.
And do you think there's a similar deification, similar reasons for deification in India, that maybe the religions come from the same source kind of thing?
Absolutely. Again, I do believe that there's sort of a common origin for all of these ancient civilizations, and whether it be ancient India, ancient China, Mesoamerica, Upper Africa, you see this deification of cattle across the globe. And again, I do believe that that's connected to ancient chemistry and the production of methane gas. And the ancient Indians were very adept chemists as well. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, for example, is one of these ancient artifacts that we still don't understand the chemical composition of that particular artifact. And it's made of iron that has never rusted, and they don't know exactly how it was made. So it's a very unusual artifact. And we found, samples of metals, for example, that were produced by these ancient civilizations that we still don't understand the chemical composition of these metal artifacts or how they were produced. So there's some very unusual things going on in the ancient world. And yes, absolutely, whether it be China, India, South America, Egypt, all of these ancient civilizations were, and particularly Europe as well, as I discussed that at the end of the book.
And this right here, this is the Giza Plateau.
So this is actually a depiction of the area surrounding Saqqara. So this here is the Step Pyramid. This is the Pyramid of Wunis, and this is actually the harbor at Saqqara. So I love these ancient depictions because it shows kind of what these structures would have looked like in their original condition. And again, my theory is that the Step Pyramid was actually a methane manufacturing complex, and so the Step Pyramid went through an evolution in its construction. It wasn't always a step pyramid. It was originally a single level mastaba. Oh, here we go. Perfect timing for that slide. So yeah, this structure wasn't originally a pyramid. The original stages of construction on the Step Pyramid were to excavate this primary chamber, and the only two original components were the inlet shaft and the outlet shaft. So you had this entire digester buried and encased within this single level platform. And that is essentially exactly what we see today in the configuration of our modern biogas digesters. And you can see here, this is one from China and this is one from India, where you have a mixing pit where your slurry is produced on one side of the complex. You have an inlet shaft leading into the digester itself, and then you have a displacement shaft going out to the other end. And that is exactly what we see in the original configuration of the Step Pyramid.
How many years was it in between each one of these? So you've got 3 different levels built onto the Step Pyramid. How many years were there in between each levels of these constructions?
So that's a very good question. I don't know the actual archaeological timeline for the construction of these 3 levels, but this was it was supposed, again, according to the dynastic Egyptian history and timeline, this was the burial place for the pharaoh Djoser, and the architect Imhotep was intimately involved in designing this structure. So again, it would have been over someone's lifetime that this structure was constructed. So let's say, 60 years or so, 60 to 100 years. And I believe that's compatible with the conventional timeline for the construction of this thing. But yeah, it started off with this single level platform, and they ended up adding on top of it and building the complex surrounding it.
Okay. And how did you originally get into your interest in chemistry? Did you study this in school, or did you just how did this happen?
So that's one of those things that, I was really inspired during my first trip in 2017 to start researching this ancient chemistry. And let me jump ahead here. I think I've got a slide of the first artifact that I found in Egypt. So this is just some background. Again, the Egyptians were producing chemicals. Again, calcium copper silicate was the first synthetic pigment that was ever produced. And the dynastic Egyptians were making this chemical on an industrial scale, because you see this paint all over Egypt. So it's not like, a crazy idea that I've just come up with, that Egypt is literally the birthplace of chemistry. So this is by far one of my favorite artifacts in Egypt, and you never really hear anything about this particular site or this artifact. So this is at a site called Abu Sir, and you can see here that there is a conduit system leading into a collection bowl at this site. So again, when I get to Egypt, I'm there to research these structures producing electricity. But this was one of the first sites that we got a chance to go, and we had special permission to visit this site, because you have to pay a small fortune to get special permission to go to this site. So we get there, and I stumble across this thing, and I'm like, this is not compatible, with the pharaonic burial hypothesis. Because if this was a pharaonic burial structure, what are they collecting in this adjacent site? And there have been some other theorists that have proposed that some of these conduits are for drainage. Well, if this was a drainage conduit, then why would you then be collecting what you were draining away from the site? So I began to realize, so this is actually a quartzite conduit. And the quartzite conduit continues through the adjacent temple and leads directly back to the pyramid that's over here to the right. And there's a black basalt floor that completely covers this up. So this conduit is directly connected to the pyramid itself. And this was the first artifact that I stumbled across that I was like, well, what are they collecting? And the first thought that popped in my head was chemicals.
So it was more of like a hunch. And then you started studying chemistry. You've only been at it for 4 or 5 years?
Correct. Yeah. So I have no academic background in the science of chemistry. I have a psychology major and a minor in Spanish, and I've always been interested and fascinated by chemistry, but I was never really academically pursuing the knowledge until I went to Egypt, and I was inspired by this first trip to literally spend. So, again, 2012, I started learning about the configuration of these structures, how they were built, what they were built with, et cetera, et cetera. And then after my trip in 2017, I've literally spent the past 4 years of my life dedicated to understanding the science of ancient chemistry, learning everything I could about the production of these chemicals, what it takes to manufacture these chemicals on an industrial scale, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the past 4 years went into learning all this stuff.
That's actually pretty impressive. I thought you had spent much longer researching the chemical aspect of this, or just chemistry in general. I thought maybe you had like a really great chemistry teacher in high school or something. My chemistry teacher sucked.
Yeah, so as did mine. And, if I could go back and do it all again, I would probably go back as a chemical engineering major. But I will say, and this is kind of a good prelude to this story. So after I got done developing this theory, I think I said this before, the universe works in mysterious ways. And so my dad is a retired Army colonel. And somehow my dad ended up going to see a presentation on the 7 principles of Hermetic philosophy, which, are you familiar with the Kabbalion?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of these great esoteric texts that talk about these 7 Hermetic principles. And dude, this is something that I never thought in my entire life my dad would go to see a presentation like this. But anyway, so he goes to the presentation, and my dad's one of those types where he'll just walk up to you and have a conversation. So he started talking to the guy. Turns out that Ed had a PhD in chemical engineering. And after I got done developing my theory, I contacted Ed, and he essentially treated me like a grad student that was presenting my dissertation. And I showed him presentations that are very similar to what I present on my YouTube channel. And he literally scientifically dismantled every single aspect of this theory, like tore it to pieces, and had me rebuild every single small detail of this from scratch. Like, what does this shaft do? And how much pressure can it create? And what is the chemical reaction occurring here, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, he believed in this theory so much that he let me put his name into the acknowledgments of my book. And this is a guy that has a PhD in chemical engineering, and he has several US and international patents in the field. So I did work with someone that has academic and professional qualifications in the field of chemical engineering. Because for me, again, I'm not an academic, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a researcher. I'm just a guy that was inspired by these structures. And I think I happened to stumble across the right theory, because as I started researching this thing and pulling at the string, the whole story started to unravel. And again, yeah, so before I ever put this out to the public, I made sure that I did my due diligence in validating this theory as much as possible. Unfortunately, with all of these alternative theories about the Egyptian pyramids, it's very much a speculative science, because they do not let you take samples. You cannot do research in Egypt unless you're a licensed Egyptologist or have a grant from a university. So it's very much just guys going and doing the best that they can to try to reverse engineer these structures. And I think that's one of the biggest deficiencies of the pharaonic burial hypothesis, is that during the early 1900s, when the science of Egyptology was being developed, they didn't understand chemical engineering. We hadn't gone through our modern industrial revolution yet. So there would have been no way of them conceiving of these structures being anything other than burials, because again, we as a civilization hadn't been through that revolution yet. But now, with our modern understanding of chemicals and chemical engineering, we can go back and kind of reverse engineer these structures to look at what they're capable of producing from our modern perspective.
And that academic that had seen your work, was he interested enough to maybe pass it around his colleagues to maybe get their opinion on it, or does it just kind of the story kind of end there?
Yeah, so he's a bit of an old guy, probably in his 70s or 80s, and he's a retired chemical engineer and kind of goes, but yeah, no, so I know for sure that my book and the material has definitely been passed around with a few of his colleagues, and even his wife is involved in chemistry, and she was an academic as well, so she read my book and they passed it all along. And again, from all of the academics that I've presented this to, I've gotten really spectacular feedback as this being one of the most, again, practical and plausible theories about the Egyptian pyramids. Because again, I can break down scientifically exactly what's happening inside of these structures. And I think that that's, again, kind of one of the big deficiencies about some of the other theories out there. Well, that they just focus on the Great Pyramid, because all of the theories say just a Great Pyramid, just the Great Pyramid. Well, that's fine. But what about all the rest of them?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But I actually, the reason I had asked that question is because I thought there would be more of an advantage there to getting that specialization to look at alternative possibilities of of what these pyramids might have been used for. Because I know if you try to pass this around to Egyptologists, they would just scoff and not even give it a look. But I thought that was my thought, is that you might have a little bit more luck with chemical engineers.
Yeah. So the ultimate goal of this this project or this undertaking is to get this in the hands of people who can actually do something with it. So again, when I was working in the IT industry, I ran across a software program called COMSOL, which is a multi-physics modeling software where you can upload 3D models into this software and test multiple different simulations of physics within these 3D models. So whether it be fluid dynamics, temperature, pressure, chemical reactions, all of these sort of things can be demonstrated within this 3D software. So again, I'm hoping one day that this theory gets picked up by somebody that's interested enough to work with me on that. to, put it in some software so we can actually test these ideas, because these are very much testable hypotheses that the person with the right knowledge, the right software, we could literally demonstrate this from a conceptual perspective and prove or disprove the theory.
And I only know the answers to this question because I read the book. But is there more of an environmental advantage to this type of production of chemicals? Because I know the way that we do it in the modern era, there tends to be a lot of waste. Is there an advantage to doing it this ancient way, or do we got it right?
So I certainly think that there was an advantage to doing it this ancient way, because again, there are no waste products. There is no environmental impact whatsoever from the production of these chemicals, because again, it's not using electricity, and they were utilizing all of the byproducts of the manufacture for other chemical reactions. So for example, within the Red Pyramid of Dashur, one of the byproducts of that manufacturing process would have been carbon dioxide. Well, they were actually reserving that carbon dioxide and using it within the bent pyramid to produce another compound. So I believe that if there were any waste products involved, they would have been utilized for other purposes, which would have basically minimized or eliminated any sort of environmental impact, which again, there's a lot of research going on for evidence of this ancient civilization having existed. And that's one of the things that they're looking for, are ecological indications of, industrialization or things like that, which they really haven't found. Well, if this ancient civilization was operating in harmony with nature, which I believe they absolutely were doing, there wouldn't have been as much environmental impact and not necessarily any evidence that there was an advanced civilization like this.
Yeah, a little bit different than selling the byproduct of aluminum, which is fluoride, to municipalities to put it in the drinking water. A little bit different.
Correct. Yeah. Which actually, where the first place that was utilized?
Where's that?
In the Nazi concentration camps.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that's where you're going with it, but yeah. Oh, yeah. I think
pretty interesting stuff there. Stay away from fluoride.
Yeah, right. No, I know it's a crazy world out there. Yeah, no, I saw a meme the other day that said, your face, and it was a woman with a surprised face. It's like your face when you ask someone for a glass of water at their house and you hear the sink turn on. It's just like,
oh yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes. So I've seen these pictures. This is fascinating. Tell the listeners what this is about.
Yeah. So, again, this is all from my 2017 trip. So I'm going there. I'm a wide-eyed, naive, just basically tourist, like along for the ride. And I was super excited. So I didn't know that we were going to get a chance to go inside any of the pyramids except for the Great Pyramid. And our guide, Yusuf, shout out to Yusuf Awian and the Kemet School of Ancient Mysticism. Yusuf is by far the best tour guide in Egypt. And he's the guy that tours with Graham Hancock and Brian Foster and Ben from, I forget the name of Ben's channel off the top of my head, but all of these researchers, even the guy from like Bright Insight, they all tour with Yusuf, and he is like the gatekeeper of ancient Egypt. So again, shout out to Yusuf for getting us inside this pyramid. So this is from inside the Red Pyramid of Dashur. And there is an overwhelming smell of ammonia inside of this pyramid. And the smell of ammonia is coming from what's depicted here on the right. It's the final synthesis chamber of this structure. And the smell of ammonia is coming from the pit inside of this thing. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not this was caused by bats. And I'm actually got a video coming up on my YouTube channel discussing the structure in detail. But I don't think the smell is related to bats inside this structure. There haven't been bats inside this structure for probably 20 or 30 years. But you can see there's some very unusual chemical staining inside of these chambers. And we've been in a lot of other pyramids in Egypt and other structures in Egypt that are filled with bats. And none of these other structures have this type of staining. And the staining that I'm particularly interested in is this dark kind of nebulous staining in the upper portion of the vault. And to me, that's kind of an indication of the high temperature and high pressure chemical reactions that were occurring inside of this structure.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Usually people will say something along the lines of like, "Oh, that's soot from the torches," right?
Yeah. So that is one of the biggest objections, that is soot. Um, well, I can 100% say that. So soot is carbon, right? And carbon is deposited on the surface of these stones. Well, there is no carbon deposit whatsoever. And if you look at the bottom of these tiers, there is nothing on the bottom of the tiers. And if that was soot from smoke, there would also be carbon covering the bottom of all these tiers. So the second thing with that, so if you are in an enclosed chamber, and this enclosed chamber is completely filled up to this point with smoke, you are in serious trouble because of carbon monoxide. So to imply that all of this staining comes from smoke, I do not believe that to be the case, because any of the explorers of these ancient chambers would have realized that you don't go in there with torches burning, because again, you're gonna be in a very dire straits. Also, this dark staining starts precisely at the bottom of the third tier. And you can see there is almost a straight line exactly where this dark staining starts in the upper portion of the vault. And that's exactly the same in the first chamber and the second chamber. So again, if this is caused by smoke, what causes that very precise delineation in the staining pattern?
Right. And how would that work out? Why is it only there up and everything underneath is clear?
So I believe part of the operation of this structure is to fill this chamber with water. So you'll see here that as you go to the upper vault of the chamber, there's significantly reduced volume in the upper portion of the chamber compared to the rest of the chamber itself. So if you look at the ideal gas laws and the physics regarding the ideal gas laws, if you decrease the volume of a gas, you are going to increase its temperature and pressure, because you're compressing all of those molecules into a small space. They're moving around a lot faster. They're heating up. The pressure is increasing. And that's also an excellent way to facilitate chemical reactions. So if you have two different chemicals in a confined space and you reduce that volume, again, the interaction between those molecules will be higher, increasing the efficacy of that chemical reaction process. And that's exactly what I believe was happening inside the Red Pyramid, is that they were using water to compress that methane gas. So the chemical reaction process starts in the step pyramid with the production of methane gas. And the methane was transported to the Red Pyramid and was utilized within this structure to produce an ammonia solution. So the first step in the process is to compress that methane gas into the upper portion of the vault. It will begin to react with water to produce hydrogen and carbon monoxide. So ammonia is hydrogen and nitrogen. So through a two-step reaction process, you're getting your hydrogen and nitrogen reactants, which are then moved into your final synthesis chamber. The final synthesis chamber is also filled with water, compressing those gases up here. So in the final synthesis chamber, that dark staining starts precisely at the seventh tier. And again, it's almost a clear line for where that dark staining is only in the upper portion of that vault. So as that hydrogen and nitrogen are compressed into the upper portion of the vault, they will begin to react, creating ammonia gas. And that ammonia gas then dissolves into the water in the chamber and is drained. And then you're collecting the ammonia solution from this chamber. So that's where I believe that the staining is only in the upper vault, as opposed to the lower portion in the chamber, because the lower portion of the chamber was filled with water.
And there were no tombs found in the Red Pyramid, right?
There were no what?
No sarcophagi, right? No pharaonic burials.
So a very interesting detail about the Red Pyramid is that this final chamber is supposed to be the burial chamber. However, there is no floor inside of this chamber. There's just a big excavated pit. So it's said that there was originally a floor inside of this chamber and that there was originally a sarcophagus. However, there is absolutely no archaeological evidence of that. And all we have today is this big pit. No markings whatsoever inside the chambers, no indications whatsoever of this being a pharaonic burial. Again, very, very unusual structure. And there's some anomalous details about this that, again, are completely incompatible with that pharaonic burial hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. And how many of the pyramids are share this quality? Like, there's little to no evidence of a burial.
So starting with the step pyramid of Saqqara, there is definitely evidence of a pharaonic burial inside of the step pyramid, because if you go and explore the lower tunnels underneath that structure, they have been retrofitted with pharaonic burial items. You have these blue faience tiles, and there are some areas of these tunnels that have been decorated by the dynastic Egyptians. However, when you look at those tunnels, most of the stuff is just plastered on the walls. So it's not a part of the original construction. It was something that came around later. And that's one of the big things in the dating of these structures, is that they are taking carbon-based materials that was placed there by the dynastic Egyptians. Even the mortar that was used by the dynastic Egyptians, that's what they use to date these structures. So again, it's stuff that is absolutely coming from the dynastic Egyptians, but I believe that they just inherited these structures and then repurposed them as pharaonic burials. I cannot say that. So when you go to the red and bent pyramids of Dashur, both of these pyramids were supposedly built by the pharaoh Seneferu, who also built the pyramid of Maidum in the Fayum Oasis. So this pharaoh supposedly built 3 different pyramids and was not buried in a single one of them. So it's very unusual, the conventional timeline and the assignment of these structures to particular pharaohs. And there's a lot of repurposing and recarving of stone. When you go to Egypt, you'll see, pieces of stone that have magnificent detailed carvings. But then there's another cartouche that's been scrawled on this piece of stone, and it's literally scratched into the surface. But they use that to date the piece of stone or to date the location, as opposed to the original carvings. So there's some reuse of these structures all across the board.
And how does that slip past Egyptologists? You think it's an ignorance thing, or an ideological barrier, or just straight a straight attempt to deceive people into making sure that the narrative is held intact?
Right. So I'm kind of a middle ground guy on that. I tend not to lead too far into the conspiracies of intentional deception. And I'm more so, this is the theory that we're currently working with. And, they're built by the pharaohs. We have this timeline already set in stone. So it's just ways for them to kind of go with what already exists in the field of Egyptology. Again, this field was developed in the early 1900s, and they already had everything, quote unquote, set in stone by the time we reach the modern era. So again, when we're reanalyzing some of these things, we're utilizing knowledge that wasn't necessarily at the disposal of the people that developed Egyptology as a science. But they had to know. Like, how could you not,
And do you know of any mainstream archaeologists that have raised objections or kind of tried to raise awareness to any of this? Not necessarily your theory, but just generally that the timeline might not be correct.
So I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know of anyone specifically off the top of my head in mainstream academia. So again, even me putting this theory out there, I took a big swing in putting all of this together, because this is, in my opinion, the most comprehensive theory about these ancient structures in terms of addressing each of the structures and it being more practical. But again, I've kind of gotten, even on my YouTube channel, I'm getting torn to pieces about this theory by people objecting to the idea because it's so new and conventional. And I think that's one of the big problems in academia, is that nobody's willing to take a risk. Nobody's willing to stick their neck out there and say, hey, this isn't compatible with what the conventional line of thought is. Let's take a look at something different. So there's really no benefit for a conventional academic to stick his neck out there and say, hey, this doesn't really add up to the conventional timeline,
right.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely hear what you're saying. All right. So what
we kind of have here in this slide is just kind of as I began to visit these sites in Egypt, I remember going back to the hotel that night after we visited the Red Pyramid, and I was envisioning all of the different configurations of these pyramids as, again, laboratory apparatus on a large industrial scale. So one of the first things that I did when I started to analyze these structures is, so there's things called units of a chemical manufacturing process, right? You have pumps, you have inlets, you have reactors, you have all these different units of a chemical manufacturing process. And if you break down the components of the Egyptian pyramids, they are very much indicative of units of a chemical manufacturing process. So I talk about these northern pump shafts on my YouTube channel. Well, that's exactly what it was. It was a pump shaft that was utilized to compress water within the system to facilitate these chemical reactions. Then inside the structures, you have your chemical reactors, you have your connecting shafts, exactly what you see in a small scale laboratory apparatus. And as we talked about before, so we know for sure that the dynastic Egyptians were manufacturing chemicals. Well, if they were capable of building structures like the pyramids, any society or civilization that is that advanced would have also wanted to implement the knowledge of chemistry on an industrial scale. The exact same thing that we did when we went through the modern industrial revolution is, as soon as we got the capability of building these things and manufacturing chemicals on an industrial scale, that's exactly what we did. And it led to a complete revolution in our civilization, which is exactly what I believe was the intention of the Egyptian pyramids, was to help reestablish these civilizations after this massive cataclysm.
Right. Yeah. So, and like you were talking about earlier, it acts as an encyclopedia for further generations in case this knowledge is ever lost. And
absolutely.
It only took a few thousand years.
Well, I happen to think that there were also some individuals that may have been researching these pyramids. And again, these things are designed for us to extrapolate information from the construction. So there had to be guys that came up with this theory before me, but perhaps it was utilized in a different manner.
Yeah, and it makes me think of so while Europe was in the Dark Ages, the Middle East was flourishing in terms of science, mathematics, and all that, and they were in possession, possibly, of much of what was recovered, as a good amount of what was recovered from the Library of Alexandria, as the theory goes, and so. That kind of that raises an eyebrow for me. That makes me think that maybe they were doing something similar, because I want to say that alchemy was at least fostered in the Middle East. I could be mistaken. It's been a little while since I've gone over some of that material, but and I know I know that the Piri Reis map comes out of old Turkish maps. So that definitely fits with all that, with everything I know in terms of that. So that's really interesting.
So let's look at the timeline again. So let's say 10,000 BC, this massive cataclysm. The survivors of this massive cataclysm reestablished their civilizations around 7,000 BC. So there had to be a point in the timeline where the pyramids began inoperational, right? Another cataclysm or another disaster, or even climate change. So when I began researching the climate of the Sahara, there's a time period from approximately 8,500 BC to right around 3,500 BC where there was significantly more rainfall in the upper Sahara. And that's the timeline that I believe that the Egyptian pyramids were in operation. So let's say that there was another massive cataclysm, a flood, or whatever it might have been, that caused the pyramids to go out of operation. So the civilization is no longer producing chemicals on an industrial scale, but the knowledge goes underground. And again, it's implemented on a small scale by the dynastic Egyptians, which that knowledge was, of course, picked up by the Arabian alchemists. And they began to disguise the knowledge of chemistry, again, under that veil of alchemy, that narrative of spiritual transformation, which is actually just describing chemistry in a spiritual allegory. So absolutely, yeah, that knowledge just went underground. It led into, like Jaber and all of these Arabian alchemists, and then it moved into Europe, and all of these practicing alchemists were still doing chemistry on a small scale. Then again, come the modern industrial revolution, we realized that we could do it on an industrial scale again, and boom, our civilization explodes.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And I believe that, even when I started researching this hypothesis, I found all of these connections in the ancient alchemical texts that were pointing me in the direction of the Egyptian pyramids. So, for example, in this slide, you see the 3 stages of the alchemical reaction process, which is the nigredo, the albedo, and the rubedo, the black, the white, and the red. Well, that color scheme is reflected all throughout Egypt. And it's actually essential in the construction of these structures as well. The black basalt, white limestone, and red granite being utilized in essentially all of the constructions across Egypt. So as I kept kind of pulling on the thread, I began to find all of these connections between the alchemical texts that were pointing me back in the direction of the Egyptian pyramids. So here on the right, you can see, again, this is just another alchemical drawing that has all these astrological symbols. But look at this. I mean, it certainly looks like a step pyramid to me. And the chemical reactions are occurring inside of this structure. And then here on the left, you can see these mound type structures, and the alchemy is occurring inside of these mound structures, which that pointed me in the direction. Well, at that point, I was already interested in researching Newgrange and all of these ancient Irish structures and passage chambers of ancient Ireland. So again, when I started to find stuff like this, it pointed me in the right direction that this theory was viable and it was something worth pursuing. So there's absolutely knowledge that was maintained by these alchemists and hidden within the veil of this spiritual allegory. It's fascinating. I love this part of it.
Yeah, that's definitely fascinating. It makes me think of the ancient mound builders in Northern America. I wonder if, man, I really wish, because we lost so many of the mounds because of the interstate highways and just massive construction and all that stuff. Who knows what would have been found in those mounds? And I mean, they're still finding some incredible stuff, and most of them aren't burial mounds either. They'll call them the burial
Correct.
mound builders and all that, but there's no burials.
Right. And so that's one of my favorite chapters in the book, is discussing Ireland and the ancient structures of Ireland, just because that's such a fascinating idea to me. And there's tons of Irish mythology that talks about magic. And again, if we look at these ancient stories of magic through the perspective of chemistry, well, these ancient gods of ancient Ireland were actually practitioners of chemistry, and they had that knowledge. So again, it would make sense that they were producing those chemicals to benefit the society. And this is just kind of a couple of diagrams showing the Red Pyramid of Dashur. For those that are unfamiliar with the configuration of this structure, one of the most important things in my analysis of the capabilities of this, again, is the engineering that went into the design of the vaults. So again, if you're using water to compress these water insoluble gases, you have to have a chamber that's going to have reduced volume at the top of it. And that's exactly what we see here in these reactors, which would allow the compression of those gases into a smaller volume, increasing the temperature and pressure.
That's fascinating. And this symbol right here is what's the ISIDA project?
Oh yeah, so the ACIDA project. So this is actually a Russian team that toured in Egypt with my same guide. They toured with Yusuf back in the 2010, 2012 timeframe. And they have an exceptional website with some of the best photos and diagrams that I have ever seen. They are very, very good researchers. And this is one of the websites where I cut my teeth looking at the Acida Project website. So they have, again, if you're interested in looking at diagrams and really, really good pictures, of course, I have some on my Instagram as well and on my YouTube channel. But if you want to check it out on a website, I highly recommend the Acida Project. And again, they toured with Yusuf, and they actually got access to, for example, the Bed Pyramid before it was ever reopened to the public, because they just opened that structure about 2 years ago.
Are they Masons, or have they just kind of used this symbol? I've actually never seen a Masonic symbol like this. It's a really creative way of doing that.
Yeah, so that's not actually, I mean, you do have the compass in there, which I think that's kind of just a reinterpretation of a Masonic symbol. But yeah, no, I mean, so again, the square and the compass, those are two Masonic tools that would have absolutely been utilized in the construction of these pyramids. I mean, people seem to forget that the Masons of the ancient world were exceptional and professional. It wasn't like these are, again, they imply that the pyramids were built by slaves, which is the biggest travesty in all of history to imply that. No, they were built by master masons, the most exceptional professionals that existed in the ancient world. And to be a mason in the ancient world was actually one of the most desirable professions that you could possibly be. You were an elite within the society if you were a stonemason in the ancient world. So it was a very important trade. And I think they just use that symbol. It's a cool symbol.
Yeah, no, I like it. Yeah, no, that I was gonna. It's funny that you brought that up, because I was gonna ask that at some point during the interview. There is no way in hell these things were built by slaves. One, it's just like you couldn't keep something like that going for so long. Not at the type of intent, like the sheer. I mean, some of these rocks you could put, you can't even put a piece of paper in between. The sheer level of skill that these took, even on the lower level craftsman version of the people like dragging the blocks over there. Right. There's no way that it could. And I want to say there was a researcher, and I wish I could remember it specifically, but he was saying that he had found something like evidence of forms of payment or record keeping of payment to a lot of these people, and that it was not slavery pay.
Yeah.
But, we could take a little bit of a detour right here. How do you actually think that they were built? How do you think they were constructed?
So there is, and again, the name of the researcher, as soon as you asked me that question, it's going to skip out of my head. But there's a guy. So I think it's all utilizing hydraulics and the knowledge of fluid dynamics. He proposes that the stone blocks were actually floated to the pyramids using a causeway system, and that they were actually floated into place. Like there were kind of wooden scaffolding constructed around the pyramid and a reservoir that was created. And again, they were utilizing, he has great videos. And again, I apologize, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but again, they was all using water. They were floating these blocks up there. They floated them into place. Everything was done using fluid dynamics.
Okay, but how are they quarried?
Yeah, so the quarrying itself, again, I always make sure to remind people to not underestimate the qualifications and the capabilities of these ancient stone masons, right? They understood how to utilize physics. And even if you look at, for example, I wish I had a slide of it here, but it's an artifact called the Hierapolis saw. And there was a water-powered sawmill that was discovered in ancient Rome. And essentially, it's a rotating water wheel. And the water wheel was utilized to move two metal blades back and forth to cut these stones. So again, I think that the pre-dynastic Egyptian civilization was utilizing wooden apparatus of these sorts to move these stones, cranes, for example, all sorts of physics-based implements to move these stones and to cut these stones. So they certainly weren't dragging them or, pulling them with rudimentary means. it was pretty sophisticated construction that utilized, so like Lebanese cedar. The cedars of Lebanon are reputed in the ancient world for being some of the strongest timber that you can possibly build with. And they were utilizing this Lebanese cedar to build these machines that assisted in moving the stone, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a combination of using water, fluid dynamics, floating the blocks into place, and then also utilizing like crane apparatuses or machines that utilized physics. It was one of those civilizations where they understood how to work smarter and not harder. So again, it's all a physics based.
Yeah, it makes a lot more sense than a bunch of people pulling these giant blocks, on, a bunch of tree trunks with ropes and a slave driver with a whip. That never really sat right with me. Even as a kid, I was like, yeah, okay. And I had seen some demonstrations of people doing it in real life, as if watching one person pull a block, 100 feet is proof of anything. I'm like, okay, but yeah, do that all day for 20 years. It's not sustainable.
Right. And so one interesting thing that I'll mention about the coring of the stones. So we were looking at some of the stones on the interior of the bent pyramid. And we found that there is a deposit of salt that runs through multiple different blocks of stone. So what they were doing is they were quarrying stones in order from the quarry site, moving them to the pyramid, and then placing them back in the exact same order from which they were excavated from the quarry.
Oh. Well,
I don't know if I just totally blew your mind there. I could see the look on your face, but so
yeah,
again,
I need a minute to process that. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were literally cutting out stones in order, moving them to the sites and placing them back in the exact same order and position that they were extracted from the stone quarry. Very, very unusual stuff.
Yeah. That is weird. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah. And even when you're exploring the Giza Plateau, so everyone talks about the construction of the pyramid itself, which is a feat in and of itself, but even the construction of the foundation. So there's all of these interlocking blocks that go into the foundation of the pyramid itself. And again, there had to be an architect at some point that designed every single piece of stone. And it's like a massive puzzle that comes together. And you don't do that just arbitrarily, where you show up at the site and say, hey, let's throw all these stones together and build a pyramid. You have to have a plan. So at some point, there was an architect that planned every single piece of stone that was going to go into the foundation, every single piece of stone that went into the body and the casings. It is so overwhelming. I remember my first time going to Egypt and walking around the Giza Plateau, that your head is literally spinning, trying to take everything in and process all of the information, because it's such an overwhelming task that they have accomplished. And again, the quality of the work and the capability of this civilization, it's reflected in the construction itself. And this thing is still here to this day. And it will probably be one of the only structures on the planet that's here forever. So these guys really knew what they were doing.
Yeah, and I think the fact that that they all line up astrologically shows a coordination over a long period of time. So not only do you have architects, planning every single block, but you have a coordinated plan being executed over a long course of time. It shows great forethought, planning, the whole nine.
Oh yeah. And again, if you were building, so if you look at the structures in the Valley of the Kings, which is where they find the majority of the burials, these look like burial sites. There's steps leading down into the structure. They are rectangle chambers, nothing fancy, very much adorned with pharaonic burial stuff. But you don't see any of that in the Egyptian pyramids. Even the shafts leading down into these structures, there is no steps. They have wooden steps in there now, but these were originally smooth, square shafts that descend at a very, very steep incline. So again, and I'll be talking about this on my channel here soon, but how are you getting the bodies in there?
Yeah, especially
So
if
if you look
how are you
at
going to get the
if you look at
sarcophagus down there? All that stuff.
correct. So if you look at even the Great Pyramid, for example, so the original opening to the Great Pyramid takes you into the subterranean chamber. Okay. Well, that's great. Well, how are you getting the body into the king's chamber? Are you going to drag it on a rope up the well shaft, the body of a pharaoh, when this was like essentially a god to the civilization? And they were very meticulous about documenting the ceremonial burial process because there was a mummy, there was a sarcophagus. The sarcophagus is in another box and they carry it to the site. And it's this big funeral procession. Well, to even get the body into the hole going into the structure, you have to build a scaffold on the outside of the pyramid. Then you're sliding the body down the shaft. That already doesn't make sense in terms of being compatible with a pharaonic burial.
Right. So, which pyramids, if any, were burial pyramids?
That's tough to say. Again, I don't want to discount any history from the dynastic Egyptian civilization. And they were absolutely building structures that were burial sites. For example, on the Giza Plateau, you have the three major pyramids, but around the Great Pyramid, there's several other smaller burial pyramids, which I believe those were absolutely built by the dynastic Egyptians. When you go inside those structures, it's a very simple entranceway that has stairs. The inside of these chambers are decked out with pharaonic burial stuff. There's statues, there's hieroglyphs, there's paintings. Everything that you would expect to see in a pharaonic burial is inside of those three ancillary pyramids on the Giza Plateau. So there's definitely pyramids that were built to be burials, but I think they were just trying to mimic what was next to it already. And they're much smaller anyway. They're like a fraction of the size.
And I've heard some people, raising the question as to why it seemed that the pyramids were degrading in quality the later that it got. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that's just an interpretation of the quality of the pyramids, but that was something that always stuck in my mind.
Oh, well, I would say that's definitely true. So when you go to Egypt, one of the most difficult things to analyze is the layering of the different stages of construction. And typically what you see is the megalithic, incredibly complex construction with the interlocking blocks and these Lego type pieces that fit together. Those are all on the bottom layer of construction. And then the dynastic Egyptians came on later and built with much smaller blocks, not megalithic pieces, essentially sandstone and limestone. And then the Romans came in, the Greeks came in, the Persians came in, all of these other civilizations came and built on top of this. But at the foundation of everything, you see these huge megalithic pieces with very different types of construction than what was utilized by the dynastic Egyptians.
Even different material?
Oh, yeah. So the predominantly with the megalithic pieces, you're seeing utilization of quartzite, red granite, black basalt, all of these exotic materials that were imported from different locations. They moved them, hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to the actual building site. Where with the dynastic Egyptians, all of the stuff is either built from limestone or sandstone,
which is much closer.
Absolutely. And a lot easier to work with too, in terms of, cutting the stone and et cetera, et cetera. But these are just a couple of so old pictures are some of my favorites because it's kind of before these structures have been sanitized and cleaned and opened for the public. So here on the left is an original picture from inside of the Red Pyramid, and you can really see the staining pattern inside of this thing. And on the right is another great picture. So today, when you go inside of this structure, the floor is completely covered up by wooden planks. And there's a huge staircase here that gets you up through this shaft into the final chamber. But you can see the crazy amount of staining that's in this chamber. And again, nobody can tell me that this is caused by bats. I do not believe that to be the case whatsoever.
Yeah,
there is some other staining inside of this chamber that could be caused by bats. There's some red drip staining in the lower portion of the chamber, which again, I'll be getting to that in a video on my channel coming up soon. But again, this dark staining is something completely different, and it's literally permeated the stone. So this staining isn't even on the surface. It's something that's been absorbed by the stone over time. It's very unusual.
And they've scrubbed this since then?
I think I lost your audio there for a sec.
Sorry about that. And I was just asking, they have scrubbed that since then?
Oh, sure. No, 100%. All of these structures have been cleaned, and they are actually cleaned on a regular basis. So I went in 2017, 2020, and 2021. So we went inside the Great Pyramid in 2020. The floor was really dirty, and I remember it being dirty inside there. And then next year when we came back, so I just got back about a month ago, I went in September of this year, and I noticed that the floor had been cleaned and mopped. So even today, they're absolutely going in and cleaning these structures. Again, there was a bunch of soot deposits inside of the Great Pyramid in the Grand Gallery. They did find a lot of soot deposits, which have been cleaned up. And yeah, so they've actually absolutely cleaned and sanitized these structures before they let people in there, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but still, because I'm sure there's a lot of foot traffic. I mean, once you get out into the more into the lesser known pyramids, I'm sure there's much less foot traffic. But I guess that makes sense.
Well, that's one of my favorite reasons for going to Dashur, which is where the red and bent pyramids are located. So when you go to the Giza Plateau, there's people all over the place, right? Tons of tourists. Everybody's taking their photos, this, that, and the other. I would say maybe only 20% of tourists that go to Egypt actually go inside of any of the pyramids. And then maybe only 5 to 10% actually go out to Saqqara and Dashur. It's a very, very small percentage of people that actually go to some of these other sites. And again, most people don't even go inside the red pyramid or the bent pyramid because it costs extra money to go inside there and do it. And your licensed Egyptology guide, which you have to have those for all tourist expeditions to these sites, you have to have a licensed tour guide, and you'll have tourist security police. Neither one of those individuals are allowed to go inside of the pyramids.
Yeah, I've heard you say that in another interview, and that's so weird. That's curious. Why? Is there a reason given for that?
So they never give us a reason. They just said that's part of the government protocol, is that the guides are not allowed to go in. And so Yusuf is not an official tour guide. He's just kind of a facilitator of the process. So Yusuf can go inside all of these structures with us. So his interpretation, and mine as well, is just that there's so many anomalous details of the structures that they don't want to jeopardize having the Egyptologists go in there and then like, where's the hieroglyphs? Or why is there no, this, that, and the other, all the questions that we've talked about, how you getting the bodies in there, right? Where's the sarcophagus? Was there any ever bodies found in here? Hold on one second.
Is your cat okay?
Get out of here, dude. So I have 3 cats, and
they fight.
I got home from work, and I didn't give them an appropriate amount of affection, so they literally just barged in the door to my office.
Dude, it sounded like they were fighting. And
that is my little guy Sam telling me it's time for dinner.
Yeah. No, it's everybody I have on the show. Everybody's got cats, and they always crash the party.
Oh yeah. Gotta love it. But yeah, no. So, to answer the question, yes, they do clean the structures. And again, I think it's very unusual that they don't let the guides go in there. It's like, okay, what are you trying to hide?
Yeah, for sure. And Man, I'm all for preserving these things, though. I think there should be some kind of test or an initiation of some type to be able to go on the plateau or the surrounding even the Valley of the Kings. Of course, that's where they get a lot of money is from tourism, but you should have to take a test, something,
Oh yeah.
and pay
Well,
an exorbitant
I
amount of money.
remember, so this was in our 2020 trip, and my friend and I were walking around the Giza Plateau, and we overheard this American woman talking to her guide, and she said to the guide, "Oh, I heard there's nothing to even see in there. So what's the point of going inside there?" And I was like, "You know what? You aren't meant to go inside there. Like, if that's your perspective, you aren't intended to go in there and see what there is to see, because there's absolutely information to be extracted from there." And I feel like, generally speaking, only certain people are called to go to Egypt anyway. So it's one of those kind of ancient sites where it draws in the people that are intended to go there. But yeah, there for the most part, I would say tourists are discouraged from going inside of the structures unless you specifically want to.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I don't know where we're at on time, man, and don't let me ramble on too long. But so we've been talking a little bit about ammonia and the production of ammonia inside the Red Pyramid. People might be like, well, what is ammonia and how is it connected to Egypt? Well, so the word ammonia and the etymology of the word is literally directly connected to ancient Egypt, and it is the birthplace of ammonia. So the original word for ammonia is sal ammoniac, which literally means the salt of Ammon. And anyone familiar with dynastic Egyptian religion will recognize the name Ammon, which was one of the Egyptian deities. And that name literally means invisible or hidden, which again is a very interesting esoteric interpretation of the Egyptian deity being connected to this chemical. So it's very interesting alternative interpretation for that. But yeah, so they were actually producing ammonia on a small scale from camel dung. And again, my theory is that any civilization that's producing them on a small scale, if you have the capability of doing it on a large scale, let's go ahead and do it. So there was actually an area in Egypt known as ammonia. So that's where the word comes from, literally the birthplace of ammonia. And again, if they could make it on a small scale, why not make it on a large scale?
Yeah, for sure. This is just fascinating.
Ooh, so this is where it really starts to get interesting, right? So we're talking about the modern industrial revolution and beginning to implement our small scale knowledge of chemistry on an industrial scale. So when I started researching the modern industrial process for the manufacture of ammonia, this is one of the first images that I found. And this was the original apparatus that was designed to produce ammonia gas. So what you'll see here, you have a shaft leading into your primary reaction chamber, a shaft connecting to the second chamber, and then your third and final chamber. See how these are at the same level, and this one is elevated above the other two? Okay. So then compare that to the configuration of the Red Pyramid. And it's exactly the same configuration. And the modern day apparatus is using the exact same physics to produce these chemical reactions. So within these metal chambers, you're essentially increasing the temperature and pressure of your reactants to facilitate these reactions that eventually culminated in the production of the ammonia solution. So in this chamber, you're producing your hydrogen. This chamber, you're producing your nitrogen. And in the final chamber, you're combining your hydrogen and nitrogen to produce ammonia. And that's exactly what I believe was happening in the three chambers of the Red Pyramid.
Yeah, you're making a good argument there that they look exactly the same in their setup.
And so the guy that developed this apparatus could have configured this machine in any way that he wanted to, right? But I do believe that the guy that made this, and I won't get into detail on that, he was in the know. And these individuals were researching these pyramids. Again, there is a very specific lineage of individuals that trace from ancient dynastic Egypt into the Arabic alchemists, into the medieval alchemists, and is that same lineage of individuals that eventually culminated in like the Royal Society of Chemistry, where we have the birthplace of modern day chemistry. So it's been the same families and lineage of individuals that have been practicing this science since the ancient times. And now, once we've rediscovered these ancient secrets, we're now implementing it for our benefit in our modern industrial society. So they say that nothing under the sun is new, right? So it's all cyclical.
Why won't you get into detail, bro? Give me the juice.
So there is a very, very juicy conspiracy theory behind all of this stuff. And I haven't really discussed it publicly yet. So that's just one of those things I might get to talking about eventually. But there's a very interesting story behind the development of this particular apparatus as connected to the Egyptian pyramids.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to get you off air on that one.
And so moving right along. But nonetheless, in the book, so I do talk about all of the different Egyptian pyramids. So again, most theories just focus on the Great Pyramid. But in my book, I talk about the function of the Step Pyramid, the Red Pyramid. In this slide, you can see the configuration of the Bent Pyramid of Dashur, which is located right behind the Red Pyramid. And I believe that this structure was utilized to produce a chemical called ammonium bicarbonate. So if you were producing ammonia solution, it'd be very difficult to transport that liquid, right? It'd be great to utilize it, but how are you going to get it out to the fields? So even today in our modern industrial process, you'll have your ammonia plant, and located directly next to your ammonia plant is either your urea plant or an ammonium bicarbonate manufacturing plant. And I believe that was the function of the Bent Pyramid, was to create ammonium bicarbonate, which is a solid compound that has a high content of nitrogen for fertilizer. And then, of course, in the book, I talk about the Great Pyramid. Again, as we were just talking about, so this is the opening that leads down into the original opening. Let me put it that way. There's a modern day tunnel that you use to get inside the structure. But this shaft right here is the only shaft that goes into the structure. So if this is a pharaonic burial, okay, so we're building our scaffold on the outside, and we're going to slide our body down into this hole here. Okay, that doesn't do us very much good because this is supposed to be the burial here in the center. So then are you going to tie your body to a rope and drag it up this well shaft, drag it into this thing? And again, where's the sarcophagus? So the rectangle container inside of the king's chamber, hypothetically, a grown man could lay down inside of that box, but there is absolutely no room whatsoever on the sides. So you can stick a body in that box, but there's absolutely no room for a sarcophagus or anything else. It would literally just be a body lying in the box, which is not compatible, again, with what we know of the process for pharaonic burials. They were put in it's like a Russian nesting doll, where you have container upon a container, and they used to stack these things. So it was huge. So where is the evidence of that inside of the Great Pyramid?
Right. Yeah. And I've seen that too.
Then I also talk about the function of the Central Pyramid, which is, again, one of those kind of forgotten structures in the alternative theories about the Egyptian pyramids. So the Great Pyramid is producing electricity. Well, what is the one right next to it doing?
Yeah, what is it doing? I don't know.
So it starts with methane in the Step Pyramid. You move to fertilizers in Dashur, so ammonia and ammonium bicarbonate. And then on the Giza Plateau, there is a much different category of chemicals that were being produced here in the Giza Plateau. And I won't spoil the surprise for anybody that wants to read the book, but again, it's two very different types of chemicals that were being manufactured in these two pyramids. And then the final chapter of the book, Aquari, the protagonist of the story, returns home to Ireland, and he utilizes the knowledge that he's gained through the degrees of the Egyptian pyramids to rediscover the original purpose for the passage chamber mounds of Ireland, like Newgrange. And if you read the book, I talk about the stone, the curbstone of Newgrange, and the symbols on the Newgrange curbstone. And to my knowledge, no one has ever interpreted these symbols. And this thing is literally sitting right out in front of the structure. And in my opinion, this is an ancient representation of a chemical reaction sequence. It's a chemical equation that describes the chemical reaction sequence that was occurring inside of this structure.
And the idea that you got for that chapter, that was based on your own. You traveled over to Ireland and you saw all this, right? Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So my first trip to Egypt was in 2017. I started to develop this hypothesis, and I knew that there was a connection between Egypt and the Egyptian pyramids in Ireland. And there's also some very interesting like population data now. They're finding that a lot of Irish people have ancient Egyptian genetics.
I've heard that.
So there's some very interesting genealogy and connections between Ireland and Egypt. So I knew that there was a connection between these two things. And I was researching the configuration of Newgrange, and I was like, I have to go see this thing in person. So in 2018, I took a trip to Ireland and literally started on the east coast of Ireland. And I took a rental car and drove all the way across Ireland, visiting all of the ancient passage chamber sites. So went to Newgrange, Low Crew, Noath, Douth, Fornox, Carrowkeel, and went to go see all of these ancient structures and was able to come up with a hypothesis for the function of these structures, which is one of my favorite parts of the book. It really ties everything together.
Yeah, I love it. There's a really nice there's a kind of a harrowing scene in there where he's inside one of these structures and it's filling up with water, so that it's really, like I was saying before off air, it's really well written. I really did enjoy it. And
well, thank you.
So
that was actually a real life experience.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So crawling inside of the structures and the thunder and the
while it was raining.
And
wow.
Water rushing into it. Yeah. So this was with my ex-girlfriend, and we were in Sligo at Carrowkeel on the top of a mountain. It took about 2 hours for us to hike up there. Had no idea how long the hike was going to be. So we get up there, I'm exploring all this stuff. She's exhausted. We're all kind of at the end of our rope at this day. All of a sudden I'm inside of this structure and I just hear just downpour of rain, and the water starts rushing in to the entrance to the structure. And then I walked out and I was like, aha, I got it. And I finally knew exactly how these things were operating. So there's a lot of real life experience incorporated in the story. And the reason I chose to do a fictional narrative, again, I don't have any academic qualifications to write a research paper. And there's a great quote by Rudyard Kipling that says, if history were told in the form of stories, then it would never be forgotten. And that was my attempt in writing this book, was just to paint the bigger picture and kind of explain my idea of what this ancient civilization was like. Practitioners of ancient chemistry disguised as magic, and this ancient secret society that was responsible for building these structures. It was just a very compelling way for me to present the information. And then within this fictional narrative is kind of a monologue of Brother Julius explaining exactly how these structures operated to the young man in the story.
Absolutely. I love it, man. I love the whole thing. I unfortunately have to wrap this up, dude. I'm actually
perfect timing too, because this is my last slide.
No, I know, but I'm angry because like I have to bump this down, and then I have another interview in a half hour. I literally there's so much more I want to ask you that we definitely have to get you back on the show.
100%. That was actually good timing. My last slide. Let me just do a couple of quick plugs. So www.thelandofchem.com is my website. my Instagram at the Land of Chem, CHEM. My YouTube channel is also the Land of Chem, same handle for all my social media platforms. Dude, I had a really, really good time. Hopefully this turns out okay.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I really appreciate you having me on.
No, thank you so much for coming on, Jeff. I want everybody to go check out his videos, buy the book. It's a great book, very well written, and definitely, Jeff, we will have you back on, man. Thank you so much for coming on.
Dude, thank you so much, and we'll touch base here in a little bit, Jay. Thank you so much. It was a good time.
Thank you, Jeff.